welcome to the Men Evolve Summit presentation with this wonderful guest, Mike Kewley. Mike Kewley is a teacher of mindfulness. He's based in the Isle of Man. He offers regular courses, workshops, retreats, and one-on-one coaching. He's been exploring meditation and non-duality for over 20 years and is the eldest son of meditation master Dhamma Charya Panadipa. I'll have to get you to make sure that I said that right. I don't want to offend. And Mike holds degrees in religious studies, Western esotericism, and his approach to mindfulness is deeply influenced by Zen, neuroscience, non-duality, and Shinzen, Young's unified mindfulness system. He has worked with thousands of individuals, helping them to develop powerful mental health skills, discovering unshakable happiness, and awaken to their true nature. Welcome, Mike. How are you?
I'm really well, thanks. And it's great to be here talking to you. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Great. Did I mispronounce any of those things there? Would you like to clarify that?
No, you did. You did really well. Yeah, Dharmacharya Panadipa is my dad's traditional title. But yeah, no, you did well there.
Okay, that's a good start. It's a good start. So yeah, this summit, obviously it's all about depression and anxiety and how we face that as men and every gender, I suppose. But I wanted to pinpoint it down to that because that's what I've faced. And I'd love to know what your perception of depression and anxiety is.
Well, I mean, it sounds like maybe my story or my background, my experience of depression and anxiety might be similar to yours. Hopefully it's similar to many people. You know, I work with lots of people with depression, anxiety, overthinking, it all kind of, feeds off each other. And this was my experience, when I was growing up in my teens. I had a kind of crisis when I was around 17, 18. Lots of pressure, lots of external pressure from different situations, and not being able to cope, and becoming depressed and anxious and being signed off work. I used to just turn up at my job, which I hated. I hated the job that I was doing anyway. It's not great for your mental health anyway. I'd wake up every morning with this knot of dread in my stomach. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't just about the job. I was working at a bank when I felt like I should be in art college or something. So it was a very different, environment for me to be in. It felt pretty meaningless to me. But to life, there's this knot of dread every morning. Basically a kind of fear about life. I couldn't do it. I didn't know what was wrong with me. How come everybody else was kind of getting on with life? And yet for me as well, because I was brought up around Buddhism, I also didn't get how people could be so seemingly content in a job that to me seemed pretty meaningless. Or they're driving around in cars and, blah, 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 houses, money. And to me, it seemed pretty meaningless, at least at that point, certainly, growing up around the Buddhist teachings. So life kind of seemed very hollow and empty. And I think that's when I discovered the French existentialists, like Jean-Paul Sartre, and they're kind of saying the same thing. Life is really empty and meaningless. I kind of felt that as a 17-year-old stuck in this job. So I was signed off work. I couldn't work. I'd turn up, break down into tears, be sent home. That wasn't much fun for anybody. And then, when you are depressed and you're anxious, and you're overthinking everything and you're stuck in your head, one option for you is medication. Hopefully we'll talk about meditation, but first port of call is often you see your doctor, your GP, and medication. So I mean, that's fine. So I had that option from my doctor, but for whatever reason, it seemed quite extreme. To my mind, at least, medication seemed, I thought, well, I'm depressed. I can't cope with life, but medication seemed an extreme kind of antidote to that. And my reasoning was that, all of the noise in my head, the voice in my head, the debilitating thoughts and patterns, I could put my hands exactly on where that noise and that voice lived. And all of the tension and stress and anxiety in my chest, the tight breathing, the panic, again, I could put my hands exactly on where that experience lived in my body. I knew it so intimately. And then the ball of dread, my stomach, this knot of dread. Again, I could just put my hand right on where that dread lived. So my reasoning was, well, hang on a second. All this stress and this anxiety and this depression is inside me. It is me, or rather, it's mine. So surely there's something I can do with it, or to it, or navigate it differently, because it's already my internal experience. So that seemed like quite natural. And so, taking a pill, although useful for many, many, many people, to me just seemed like, well, I don't need an external solution for an internal experience. So so I didn't take medication, and I did explore meditation. And you mentioned my dad briefly. So he's been a teacher of Buddhism all my life. He still teaches now. So he was living in Israel at the time. So I remember receiving my first meditation instructions on the phone from the Isle of Man. He was in Tel Aviv, and he told me, here's what you do: sit with the calm posture, close your eyes, try and find your breath. And so I started a formal meditation practice from that day onwards. And I took it deadly seriously, because I did not want to go onto medication. And I also didn't really like being the person I was. So I wanted to change that. So I wasn't playing around with meditation. I would sit every morning, and I would only sit for maybe 10, 15 minutes every day. But I can honestly say that after about 6 weeks, my entire life had flipped, had changed. And that was just from 6 weeks of daily practice. And the best way I can describe it, looking back, was up till then, it was like I'd been living. You're in London now, aren't you?
Yeah. Yep.
So it was like I was living in like Victorian London, with the smog and the fog and the smoke, and you can't really see your hand in front of your face. Everything is murky and dark, and maybe Jack the Ripper's around the corner. It's just a scary situation. It's terrifying, because you're a kid, you're 17. What do you know? And then this was like, through the mindfulness practice, I suddenly noticed there was like a hill, and I'd never noticed the hill before. And it was almost like doing the practice allowed me to walk out of the fog and the smog, and down, and for the first time in my life have a kind of clear perspective, and realizing that small city that I was living in was just one tiny feature of the total landscape of life, of experience. And yet when you're in it, that's everything. That's all you know. So that's how I describe the effect that meditation had on me in a short space of time. And yeah, I'm 41 now, and I've just been practicing ever since, really.
Wow, inspirational, Mike. Yeah, thanks for sharing it and putting it into that way. So consistency of practice was kind of what helped you out there. How long did you practice for? Like how many minutes, or how many was it every day, every morning, or something like that?
Yeah. So it was, ritualistic or disciplined in that sense. So every morning, usually before, after waking up, but before leaving the house, building in that space, that 10 minutes, and not really knowing at first what I was doing or what was meant to happen, but just following the instruction. I mean, that's the nice thing about meditation, certainly mindfulness. It's very nuts and bolts. I mean, it's mechanical. you just do the practice, the effect is just generated. So I didn't really know what was supposed to happen. I certainly wasn't enlightened, after the end of the 6 weeks. But my relationship to my own mind and my emotions and what happened around me at work, for instance, completely changed. My attitude, my perspective completely changed. And it changed so much that the relationship I was in at the time came to an end, because I noticed I couldn't really join in anymore with some of the perspectives of people around me, because they suddenly seemed quite limiting. And suddenly I was experiencing my life from a more open place where I didn't have to know the next move. And it was very freeing. But to the outside, it can look like the opposite. Like one minute you know what you're going to do with your life, and then the next minute you're like, well, who knows? Who knows what the next 10 seconds is going to bring? And that can look a bit like you've suddenly lost something there. But the experience was completely freeing.
Wow, and that was from meditation and mindfulness together. Did this become like a daily practice? Do you bring mindfulness like in your daily life also? That's my understanding of mindfulness. It's a moment to moment practice also. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So at first I was basically doing Vipassana meditation, which is what my father taught, which is like very traditional Theravadan Buddhist meditation practice, which
Mm-hmm.
sounds complicated, but you're basically just shifting your focus into your breath. I mean, and that's it. And when it gets dragged into thoughts again, at some point you just recognize that you've gone into thought and you purposely redirect into breath again. Because your brain is like a muscle, it's developing and adapting even now as I'm talking and you're listening. Your brain is on, it's a process, it's alive, it's responding. So, I
Yes.
didn't know the neuroscience behind it at the time, but I was changing the way my mind worked, which then affects the way my brain operates, which now I think is just absolutely fascinating. This is called self-directed neuroplasticity. So the human
Wow,
brain is
haven't heard of
built.
this. Let's go into this.
Well, it's just that the fact that, I mean, if you've heard of neuroplasticity, so the fact that the brain is a process, it's alive, it's moving and adapting and learning right now, it doesn't switch off.
Mm-hmm.
Great, okay, but by consciously choosing where we want to place our attention and the kind of things we want to take our attention away from, we can change the way the brain directs and adapts itself. So that's self-directed. It's like, well, you can float on the boat and you can just let the boat go wherever it wants to go, where the tide takes it, or you can learn how to sail. And you can choose to
Yes.
to steer that boat towards the places you actually want to go. So that's what we're doing through the mindfulness practice. So yeah, for me it was just meditation, but then that spills over, of course, into your daily life, because it's like a
Mm-hmm.
muscle. The more you train that muscle, even when you're not doing the practice, the strength is there. So yeah, I found myself being far more present in my life, far less consumed by past or future, available to whatever popped up in front of me. And so life suddenly became very vivid. It was like living with the sunglasses off. And until then, it had kind of been like I was wearing dark sunglasses and not really
Yep.
seeing life, thinking about life yet. But that's not the same as seeing, smelling, tasting, engaging with life, because an idea is not life. And
Yes.
most of us are living in a kind of movie about life. And
Yes.
no wonder we feel depressed or there's a lack of meaning, because there's no meaning in the movie. The movie is a kind of abstract thing. It's a story about life. To experience life directly, we have to kind of put that movie to one side and see and taste and touch So that's kind of what the practice gave me initially, was this ability to almost put my mind down and fully engage with every single moment, which felt completely fulfilling, satisfying. Um, and when you do that, you're onto something, because life
Mm.
previously had never felt that intense and wondrous. I mean, maybe, when you're a child, you're living in that state anyway, until we kind of grow up and we grow into our heads almost, we grow into our minds,
Yep.
which, is for a purpose. But most of us stay there. The rest of our lives, we're just locked into this um, abstract, thinking about life.
Mm-hmm.
So this practice allowed me to kind of shift away from that and back into this more childlike experience of who I was, what the world is, and where, as you mentioned earlier, just before we started, I think, where you don't have to know. The fun is
Yeah.
that nobody knows.
Yeah. And as
Yeah.
I was also saying, it can come across, and you kind of alluded to it a little bit, it can come across a little bit lofty or almost crazy like, because
Yes.
when someone asks me what I'm doing and I say I don't know, that could almost seem as though I don't know what I'm doing with my life. But internally, I know all I need to know is already here, and that is the main thing that I think doesn't cause me as much suffering as it used to, is because there's no attachment to any outcome that is coming into my projection, or I'm not even projecting outwards into something to then get attached to then create some type of assumption or to move that way. So yeah, I love what you said about drawing your attention, like what you put your attention towards creates the neuroplasticity in your brain. So because I really felt when I was going through that depression, anxiety, that I would really focus all the way in on it, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that would almost keep me in that spiraling cycle almost. And then it wasn't until somehow I just met the right people at the right time, and then went into a meditation course and then started to realize what the stream of thought was. And then, I mean, it took me a long time to get like into a space to understand that stream of thought moving different ways. So how would you, like, if someone is focusing their attention on, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm negative about life, or what, how would that person steer the ship back
Mm-hmm.
towards a mindfulness state or these states that you talk about?
Yeah. Well, thankfully it's not really difficult. They just have to kind of be interested. And so, you just mentioned your own experience there, and that's the same as mine, where it's almost like you end up watching this movie in your head that, even though is awful and terrible, and you don't actually want to be watching it, you just sit there anyway eating the popcorn.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, you don't
Literally
have to
like
watch
chocolate
this
popcorn,
particular
just feeling
film.
sad.
Like, why
Yeah.
yeah, it's a big feedback loop. So again, in neuroscience, they say that mental states become character traits. So, our repeated states of mind kind of soak into us, and they're actually character building. So you
Mm.
become a sad person, or you become an angry person, depending upon the kind of thoughts that um, get stuck to or attached to or put meaning on. And we're all doing it. The other thing is that when people they say to me, "Oh, I can't stop thinking. I, catastrophize. I get dragged into anxious thoughts and things like that." They say, "What's wrong with me?" And I have to differentiate here and say, you are okay. You are fine. You are whole. Completely okay, sane, capable.
Yes.
The mind, however, that needs some training, because the mind is just built for survival. It's not built for meaning. It's not built for happiness. It may come as a newsflash, but if you want to be happy, it's not really going to happen going into your mind. Your mind
Mm.
just wants the next thing and the next thing, and I mean, and it just keeps on going. It's like
Mm.
being on a merry-go-round and saying, I really want to get off the merry-go-round, but you don't. You just stay on it. So you kind of have to put the mind down at some point. So yeah, so mental states become character traits, and the brain has this negativity bias. You know, for evolutionary purposes, it does catastrophize because that's practical, or at least it was, you know, in times gone by. And you know, we're sat here chatting away on Zoom, you know, modern technology, but this is a Stone Age brain. This has not changed.
Wow.
You know, so it's still doing the same stuff it's kind of always done. But
Why
what we
does it
know
do that?
is,
Why does it catastrophize?
I suppose it's evolutionary. You
Mm.
know, it's
Yep.
allowed us to project and abstract. You know, more than any other mammal anyway that I'm aware of, that we can actually abstract and think ahead to a time that literally doesn't exist now.
Mm-hmm.
Or we can remember something that again literally doesn't exist now. So on one hand, as I always say, you know, the mind is just incredible. It's so incredible, creative, vivid, practical. You know, it's taken us to the moon. I mean, the mind is amazing, but often we're not really using the mind, not purposely, not consciously. We're just being used by the mind. And for most of us, it's just chewing us up. And that's not fun. So, what we can start to do then is purposefully shift our attention around, which is kind of basic mindfulness, you know. So what I do with people then is teach them how to redirect their focus into their present moment experience. So you said before, you know, it can seem crazy that we could say, I'm content with being here in this particular moment, and that's enough. Well, what about your plans? What about your ambitions? What about your goals? But actually, they're all based on the future, which literally does not exist right now. I mean, where is it? So all of that is based upon imagination. In fact, it's just imagination, projection, which is completely intangible. The only thing right now that is tangible for us is this moment. So this is the sanest place you could be, because it's the only place that's actually real. So to me, it's the sanest thing you could do is say, okay, you know, I'm happy to be completely present in this moment, because yeah, where else are you going to be? But for people that live in the past or the future, it kind of tears us apart because, you know, we want to be here, but we can't be here. So yeah, that's what I get people to shift their full attention into their ordinary present moment, real-time experience. So sight, smells, maybe anchoring our focus onto the feeling of breath. And then once you do that, in a sense, that's when the magic starts to happen, because we're shifting out of the mind, which triggers us. You know, so the mind is often prompting you to do something else. You know, it's often, if it's catastrophizing, you'll then be triggered by that emotion. You know, or a memory. So we are constantly triggering ourselves. You know, we don't need anybody else to wind us up, to be honest. You know, you don't need, you know, external enemies, because we're constantly giving ourselves a turbulent experience. So when we shift away from the mind and into our just effortless, ordinary experience, for instance, listening, and this might be something people can do right now, just an experiment. If you just close your eyes for a moment and just listen, just notice the sounds that are coming and going for you. And notice as you're listening if your mind has gone quiet or still. Okay. So that's just a quick little experiment. But I mean, did you notice that the mind calmed down or became quiet when you were listening?
Yeah, for me it did. but I have a feeling that some people watching, because sometimes if this is the first time that you've ever been experienced that, or if you've ever gone, all right, I'm going to stop everything and I'm just going to listen.
Yeah.
Sometimes I remember when I first started doing this type of stuff, it would kind of be almost the toughest times, because it's
Yes.
kind of like I finally sat and dealt with my shit, like, or let the things arise that I'd kind of been suppressing through alcohol, through partying, through whichever avenue I was using to distract myself from dealing with that part of myself, or that part of my mind that I didn't really want to face. So what would you say if a person or if your client came to you with that kind of scenario?
So they're saying that, for instance, when we
When
just
you stop, the
listen.
mind starts to go really active.
So if they said to me, for instance, I've noticed that when I listen, or when we get still, or when I try to focus, my mind is just really active with all the
Mm,
stuff that I've been trying to avoid, repress, ignore. I say,
mm,
well done. I say, well done. You've seen it. This is the mind.
mm.
Lesson one
Yes.
of meditation is, can you notice just how busy, crazy, mad, frantic,
Mm-hmm.
non-stop this mind
Mm-hmm.
is? And it's not just your mind, this is the
Uh-huh.
human mind. Everybody's
Yeah.
mind is like that. Now, we've got our own stuff, yes, but
Mm-hmm.
step one is to go, oh, I can't do it because my mind is, no, you're doing it. You're
That's it.
aware of it. You're
Wow.
already aware of it.
Mm,
So there's no failure in this. So if you
mm,
listen then and you noticed, oh yeah, like there's nothing going on between my ears, it's quiet, that's great. But if you notice, no, my internal voice is saying this is a load of bullshit or blah, 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 fine as well. This is all
mm.
just a practice anyway. So,
Yes.
with practices, the more you do it, the more repetitive you progress. But for
Yes.
instance, sometimes when you listen, the mind just goes quiet sometimes. So when the mind is quiet, what's triggering you? Like, there's no thought there to say, hey, what next Tuesday? No, that's gone. So when we start to shift down into our sensory experience, like listening, feeling how your body is on the chair, noticing that you're already breathing, the mind tends to settle. It's not a light switch, takes time, takes practice, but it tends to calm, soften, ease, like a dimmer switch almost. It tends to drop.
Mm,
And suddenly you start feeling okay, relaxed, because all that triggering has calmed down. When the mind goes completely quiet, you then start to experience yourself um, without that bundle of thoughts that the mind gives you. Here's who you are, here's what you do, here's your job, here's what you're good at, here's what you're rubbish at, here's what you should be afraid of. All of that fades out, which is a very profound experience. It's very, very common. It's not particularly mystical, but as soon as the mind becomes quiet, you experience yourself much differently, because you're not being defined by your mind. It's not telling you who you are.
mm-hmm.
And when we do that repeatedly, what we're dropping into is the flow state, or a state of flow, which I'm sure you're aware of, and I'm sure some of the listeners know about flow state.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so yeah, we often find it in sports, or any activity really where you're engaged and focused, or anything that we love doing. We tend to go into a flow state, which in a nutshell means that past and future just fall away. You're absorbed, you're engrossed in whatever it is. Doesn't really matter what it is, whether it's skydiving, ironing, gardening, painting, running. It can literally be anything, which is the same as saying meditation can be anything. It all depends on how you're doing the thing. you know. So it's not just about being sat still on a cushion, it's about how are you engaging with every single moment of your life. So the more you drop into this flow state, by shifting your attention, states become traits. So the more you're spending time in a flow state, which feels focused and calm, you're literally building in focus and calm. So you're becoming a more focused, more calm person. And the other stuff just starts to fall away, wind down. So in that sense, it's very transformative. It transforms character, habits, less reactive, calmer, more focused, more creative, more present, less, you know, dragged into past and future. And that feels like you have more control. So that's kind of what I do, because, you know, 99% of the people that I work with say, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, my mind won't stop, I can't sleep because my mind can't stop. And then I say, well, all we're going to do is sit still. And they think, how is that going to help? Well, because you can leave the cinema. That's the whole point. You don't have to sit there watching this movie anymore. There's a door. Take your attention away, and suddenly you're not watching the film. And if you keep doing that, what tends to happen is over time, those movies tend to fade out until, you know, like me, you have the experience where one day you're kind of scratching your head and you think, oh, that particular thought that I always had, it just hasn't popped up for like 6 months. What you know, what have I been doing? And it's not really what you have been doing, it's what you've stopped doing. And what we stop doing is watching that movie every time it enters our head.
So you stop feeding that train of thought that goes into that movie, as you say, and it generally
Precisely.
subsides and dissolves, which has also been my experience. Is the practices, that's a good way to describe it. There's a dissolving of it, and it's kind of like when you're injured. I used to play football, so you'd be injured, and then you just become not injured. You don't sort of run around going, oh, I don't have a sore knee anymore. I don't have a sore knee anymore. You just go, man, I'm running good. Like I'm running good. And that's kind of, I think that's what I like to think about when we're doing this stuff is you're not going to think back and go, there might be moments where you think back and go, oh, I'm not depressed anymore. But probably mostly be in that flow state where you're just totally absorbed in life and in what's happening around you, that all of those things are just like way behind you. And that's what I'm motivated to share about and to talk with you about, to get people from this point of being caught in this sort of train of thought and to see it as a mind and as a way to step back into this place of awareness, really, isn't it? Because we're cultivating awareness, which is always here. We're always
Yeah.
aware. We're always aware, even when we're sleeping. We know we're asleep. Like I don't know about that. That'd be an interesting one to. I don't, have you got to a space where you are aware of your sleeping? That's pretty deep.
There is a practice that I do for that.
Uh-huh.
I
Okay.
mean, that's another conversation, but
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, there's a practice where you move through lucid dreaming, and then you
Yep.
try to be aware of deep sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And but yeah, you're right in that you said, you know, we're always aware, because sometimes I will ask people, you know, who is it that watches your dreams? Because you're asleep.
Mm-hmm.
So the awareness is on, you know.
Yes.
But you said there, you know, this is the kind of space you want to invite people into, because the mind is malleable. I mean, this is the
Mm-hmm.
big thing, is that, you know, we know that if you get a knock on the head and damage your brain, it will affect your mind. So brain
Mm-hmm.
affects mind. But we also know the reverse is true, that what you do with your mind affects your brain. And actually, let's say that your brain is not just this lump of matter in your skull, but it, includes your spine and your nervous system and your whole experience. So what we do with our mind is so important. Our attention is our most valuable commodity.
Yeah, we're getting
And
shown that as well.
when we what? Sorry.
We're getting shown that as well with the way technology is going, and it's actually being
Yeah.
commodified. And it's actually, we don't need to go into that, but I'd like to. Sorry, I
Yeah.
cut you off there. Keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's it. Yeah. That's why everybody wants it. Most valuable thing. But when we can, drop into our present moment experience, again, why? Well, because that's the only moment you actually are experiencing now. There isn't another one. So let's pay attention to it. When you focus into your senses and the mind calms down, you go into that flow state. Now, that flow state has been equated with happiness. Now, often we think that happiness is like a high, like you're really happy, you're up, skipping down the street or whatever it is. Well, that comes and goes. That goes up and goes down again. In meditation, we sometimes hear about this word bliss, which is often why they might get into meditation because they think, well, that sounds great that I could be sitting here still and be in this blissful state. And often one of the misconceptions is that bliss is this kind of massive high that's going to strike you like a lightning bolt. And if you're lucky, if you're one of the lucky ones, you get this. But the way I understand bliss is much different, which is that bliss is when you experience yourself as problem free. So when the mind calms down and becomes still, and you're just present in the moment, there's no problem because there's no mind coming in to create that problem. So by doing this mindfulness practice and being present, you are in bliss, meaning you have no problem in that moment. You are not being burdened in that moment. Now, that's happiness, but it's not the happiness the mind thinks of. The mind wants a different kind of happiness. But bliss is really simple, it's really subtle. But when you drop into that space, you're completely fulfilled. It's the most fulfilling place. The happiness is not located in a country or in a certain kind of car or anything, or a palace. It's here, it's within. It's a state that we can drop into that's already here. Salvador Dali famously said, I don't do drugs, I am drugs.
Wow.
So it's all here. We are chemistry sets.
Yes.
It's not even that, esoteric or special. I suppose what's weird is that we don't really know that as humans. We're just trying to chase this external happiness, which is a bit like, trying to pick up soap. Like you get it and then it's gone, and you get it and it slips, and you get it and it slips. And we're just doing that. I mean, how frustrating.
Yeah, why are we, I feel as though that's our natural state, what you're describing. How have we become disconnected from that, like separated from that? Because that for me seems to be the pinnacle. That's the depth of all of the problems, all of the mind's problems, is this feeling of separation from our natural source, from our natural way that we should be moving and interacting. What do you see as causing that? I mean, I think we've probably covered it all in this whole talk, but I'm sure there's something else that we can add to, like, what's maybe the first point of contact that's causing that separation.
So do you mean separation from life, from the world, from meaning?
From being, from being in our natural state, like what's causing that separation? The mind, essentially. I'm kind of answering my own question, but it's kind of the mind that's causing that separation, and that's what we're talking about. Once we see that mind as a mechanism and we get behind that into a space of awareness, those problems that you're talking about, they can still come up, but they're seen as like an old pattern that's just in that space of the mind. That's been my experience anyway. When I learned that it's not about trying to fix every single problem that's comes up, it's about seeing that as something that is just continually going to keep going until you like almost train or build that space up inside of you that can say no to that and they can not pay attention to that. Then it's just about cultivating that place. And I like the way you said holding on to a piece of soap, because I feel as though when you do have these experiences, for me, there's been like a fear of losing a certain state of bliss or happiness, or however we want to talk about it. And then there's kind of a dread of falling back into personhood or back into mind, and then understanding that and then coming. So it's kind of, I like to talk about it because I think that there needs to be guidance when you're coming from a place where you're fully in the mind and you're very affected by what the mind is projecting and by it being in the past and present. And I think there needs to be some guidance into um, guiding people out of that and what they experience, and how can we support that experience of coming back into a natural state. I don't know if I'm leading towards a question here because I'm kind of answering my own, but do you have any more to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, this is like completely fascinating. Um, I just going back to what you said there, at the start of that. I mean, the separation is natural. It's a part of natural development. No one chooses to be separate. As children, we don't say, well, right now I feel fused with my mother because I have no sense of separation yet, because my mind hasn't created a mind-based self that lives in here, and therefore everything else is out there, which is terrifying. I mean, I guess that's the first trauma, is that I'm separate from everything. I'm in here, and
Yeah.
there's a huge unknown world out there. Whoa.
Yep.
Well, there's fear then.
Yep.
So, but that's a natural, again, we don't suddenly decide I'm going to have a sense of self that's going to separate me from the world. So that when I look up at the stars, I think, oh, well, they're stars and I'm here, rather than just, wow, I'm merged with stars.
Mm.
So, yeah, the mind kicks in, we conceptualize, we abstract, we create this. When I say we, I don't mean we, I mean a sense of self is created.
Mm-hmm.
That's a natural thing. It serves a purpose. But what I think is, because our culture then is completely directed towards the intellect and the mind, and to
Mm-hmm.
encourage the intellect and thinking and logic, all of which is fantastic, but it's like one tool in the box. But
Mm.
we're only emphasizing that one tool. Then we don't have another option for exploring ourselves differently,
Yep.
because that doesn't exist in our culture. We don't have a yoga, we don't have a mindfulness or a meditation tradition. I mean, we did, it was bound up with Christianity, and going further back, most cultures in the world have a kind of a way of being, but we've been completely divorced from ours. And with the technology, again, it's all about the mind,
Yes.
enforcing that mind-based identity. And that's the way we talk. You don't hear people saying, oh yeah, but of course, I'm not the thoughts in my head. I'm more than it because I'm aware of the thoughts in my head. Or, when I was 17, and that was one of the first kind of insights I had, was that, oh, yeah, I'm not the voice in my head, because I was listening to it. So how can I be it if I'm listening to it?
Wow.
Obviously that's just a voice. And it's like, oh, okay. And that, of course, begs the question then, well, what am I? Which, maybe we can get to, but we don't have those conversations. Like I use the examples like on game shows where they introduce the contestants. It's like, hey, hi, okay, you're David, and you work as a gardener, and you're from Australia, and you're 35, and your hobbies are. That's not you. That's just information. I mean, that's got
Yeah.
nothing. That doesn't even touch what you are. but we're not having
Mm.
that conversation because we have no tradition to encourage that conversation. So we end up living out our lives from our heads, from this sense of separate self, which
Mm.
does not feel fulfilling
Yep.
because there's always something to do and protect, and there's always fear. But of course, this is the other thing, is that in my experience, the fact that there is no self ultimately, you know, and this you could ask a Buddhist monk, you could ask a neuroscientist, they're going to agree with this. You know, like there is no actual person in your head doing all the work. I mean, that's just a myth. And it doesn't actually take that much for that to be exposed. In fact, there's many moments every day when that sense of self just isn't happening. You know, when
Mm.
people say, "Oh, you know, I drive in my car and I don't know how I get to the petrol station. I just suddenly arrive there."
Yep.
Well, who's driving the car? You didn't need
Yeah.
that mind-based me. Right now, I'm going to steer this way. Now I'm going to move the clutch. You didn't need that because something automatically, some intelligence was able to drive you home, and you didn't even notice. You didn't
Mm.
notice anything. So we
Yep.
get on quite well without this, you know, mind-made self interrupting. And the meditation, as I describe it, is just the practice of putting the mind down. It's like, thanks, mind, you are an amazing tool, but I don't need you right now. So I put you
Yep.
down, and we just rest in this state that is therefore bigger than the mind. That's it. And that, in a way, that's moving into the exploration of what you are. You know, because if you were the mind would always be here non-stop. There would be no gaps. You know, deep, there wouldn't be deep dreamless sleep because it would just be filled with thoughts. But we don't. We fall asleep. The mind goes kaput. There's a blank. There you go. That's how you know you're not your mind, because it comes and goes.
Perfect. Yeah. Amazing. So deep, Mike.
But
Yeah. I'm really, really connected. Keep going. Yeah.
well, I was just going to say, but yeah, the point is that our culture isn't having that conversation or talking about that. So we don't know, which is quite sad, really, because people are locked into this very small version of themselves, and no one's telling them, well, they are, because I'm doing it and you're doing it,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
actually many
We're
teachers
starting
are.
to. We're starting
We're
to.
starting to.
Yeah.
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 And it doesn't
Yeah.
take much for someone to have that glimpse, like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, like it's actually fairly simple, because the mind is actually so fragile and such a thin layer, if you like. So it doesn't take much just to poke a hole through that for someone.
Yes.
um yeah.
So that's kind of, we haven't even said the word ego, but I'm assuming we'd be putting that into the same context as the like mind identity. That's the way I see it also. I don't know why I felt like bringing that up, because that could be another
Mm.
whole conversation. I suppose for me, is there like a mind and an ego and an awareness? Because for me, there seems to be an identity that likes to almost grab hold of even like a spiritual or mystical experience. There may be like some, I may like want to hold on to that. And I've seen within myself, there's an identity that's created within that experience. And then I've done some work to also move, like, then it starts again to see that there's another train of thought, another projection of the mind that's creating another identity that may have dropped this whole identity, but it's creating another identity. So for me, I've seen like the mechanism of
Mm.
this constructed reality, and then it constantly keeps getting broken apart until I just keep coming back into now, into now, into now. And then there's no need to construct anymore, or the mechanisms, like, it's it doesn't construct because it's
Mm.
like the power isn't there for it. Power isn't there
Mhm.
for it. I think I just felt like sharing more than asking a question. But
That was great. That was really nice.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's really
and of
good.
course that's the kind of what the mind does. It's grabbing hold of everything because
Yes.
actually the mind doesn't know what it is. You
Mm.
know, it's like, oh, I'm a thought, I'm a feeling, I'm this, I'm that, I have to be this, I have to be that. So it's trying to make, do you say it's trying to make an identity out of nothing really, because any experience that says hello is going to say goodbye again. You know, it's like
Mm.
wave after wave on the ocean. No wave is going to stay for long. So how can you construct a solid identity out of fleeting moments? It's just not going to work, but it keeps trying. Yeah. And that's just
Yes.
what it does. I mean, that's its job. So at some point you're like, oh, that's just what it's going to do. Okay, well, I just have to realize that it's just not me. You know, as the awareness, I'm always more than or bigger than any experience.
Yes. I feel like we could talk for another 3 hours, so I better call it because the whole summit would just be me and you just chatting. So
Yeah.
thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you, David. Thanks for inviting me. And I hope, our conversation was useful. And I guess, from your experience and mine, we're two men who have struggled with mental health, depression, anxiety. And in similar
Mhm.
ways, we found a way through it. And we're just sharing that back to people. And, it's actually simple once you're shown that it doesn't have to be difficult.